The year was 2021. The world was slowly starting to move again after the pandemic, but the streets still felt empty and strained. I was driving for Uber to earn extra money. My name is Karen Miller, and I usually worked late shifts. That night, the city felt like a ghost town. I was tired and hoping for one last trip so I could go home and sleep. The app made a loud noise, signaling a new request. The name on the screen was Monica. The pickup was at a local bowling alley about 5 minutes away. I followed the map to a large, dim parking lot. Most of the lights were out, but one street light was still working. Standing right under that light was a person who immediately caught my eye. She was incredibly beautiful. She had short, stylish auburn hair that glowed under the yellow light. She was wearing a short black dress with laces up the front and tall gladiator sandals that went up to her knee. She looked like she was dressed for a high-end party, not a quiet night in a parking lot. I rolled down my window and asked if she was Monica. She didn't say anything, but she nodded with a soft smile and sat in the back seat. The destination was far from the city center. As I drove, the bright lights of town faded away. We entered an area that felt completely abandoned. There were no streetlights here, just tall trees and empty lots. Eventually, the GPS told me to stop in front of a specific house. It was a terrifying place. The house was rotting, the paint was peeling off the walls, and the windows were boarded up with wood. The yard was a mess of tall weeds and trash. It looked like nobody had lived there for years. The passenger leaned forward. Her voice was smooth and very calm. She told me to let the meter keep running because she had to go inside for a moment. I watched her walk through the tall grass. She moved very gracefully. She opened the front door of that dark, scary house and went inside. I sat in my car with the doors locked. The silence was heavy. I kept checking my mirrors, feeling like someone was watching me. After a few minutes, I saw movement in a window on the second floor. The woman was standing there, looking down at me. She waved her hand, signaling for me to come inside the house. She told me to come in so she could give me the money for the ride. I felt a sharp knot of fear in my stomach. The house was pitch black and looked dangerous. I didn't want to leave the safety of my car. I shook my head and told her no. I told her I would stay right there and wait for her to come back out. She didn't argue. She disappeared from the window and came back out the front door a minute later. She got into the back seat and asked me to take her to the club district downtown. I drove back toward the city. I thought she might be meeting friends, but when we got to the club area, everything was dead. Because of the pandemic restrictions, the bars were closed and the neon signs were dark. There was no music and no people on the sidewalks. It was a very lonely sight. I pulled over to the side of a road and told her the ride was over. I checked the screen and told her the total was $17. She reached forward to hand me the cash. As she spoke to thank me, I finally realized the truth. The light from the dashboard hit her face, and I heard the deep, resonant tone of her voice. In that moment, I knew she was a ladyboy. She was so beautiful and elegant that I hadn't even suspected it during the entire trip. She opened the door and stepped out. She didn't look back. I watched her walk down a dark side street until she vanished into the shadows. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my heart. I reached for my phone to end the trip on the app, but something was wrong. The app had not updated. It still showed that I was supposed to pick up Monica at the bowling alley. I thought the app had frozen, so I tapped the call button to see what was happening. A woman answered immediately. She sounded very different from my passenger. Her voice was harsh, loud, and very angry. She told me her name was Monica. She said she had been standing outside the bowling alley with her briefcase for over 20 minutes. She asked me why I hadn't shown up yet. I looked at the empty back seat. Then I looked at the $17 in my hand. My skin crawled. I realized I had picked up the wrong person. I had driven a total stranger to a dark, abandoned house and sat there while they watched me from an upstairs window. I didn't know who the person in the black dress was or why they wanted me to come inside that house. I realized how lucky I was that I stayed in the car. I realized then that because I was so tired, I had made a massive mistake. I hadn't asked for any verification. and had completely skipped the OTP part in my hurry to start the trip. I drove home as fast as I could, constantly looking in my rearview mirror, wondering who had really been sitting behind me.
This incident happened to my best friend about 3 years ago. She was 19 back then and was working with an international company for client dealing processes. I don't have a whole lot of information about her work, but the one thing I know was that she was getting more than enough for her work. So let us begin her story. She was doing her regular work in her office when she got a call from her old school friend. Her friend invited her to a reunion party that was being held in her hometown. She was away from her family and friends for so long, so she agreed at once. She booked a ticket, and the next day, she prepared everything to leave for her hometown. She took her luggage and booked an Uber for the airport. Her cab was about to arrive in the next 7 minutes, so she waited there until the cab arrived. She went to the cab and shared the OTP to confirm her ride. Later, she loaded her luggage inside the car and jumped in. The driver was wearing a mask and only half of his face was visible to her. Even then, his face looked a little creepy and he had a huge scar on his face from his right eye to his forehead. It looked like someone cut through his whole face with a sharp object. She was getting some strange vibes, but she had no time to think about such things, so she asked him to move on. He started the car and moved ahead. During the whole trip, he didn't say anything to her, and neither did she. After driving for continuous 40 minutes, she finally reached the airport, and here came the twist. She paid for her trip and tried to get out of the car, but before she could do anything, several cops came running and surrounded the car while pointing the gun toward her and the driver. She couldn't understand anything. The cops were continuously shouting to get out of the car. She hadn't done anything wrong, so she had no worries, but even then, she had a horrifying expression on her face. She put her hand behind her neck and got out of the car. The cops surrounded her and took a few steps away from the car while pointing the gun at my friend's chest. She was so scared, but continuously screaming that she had done nothing and was innocent. The driver also faced the same action as her and was taken just beside her. The cops asked him to remove his mask, and this was the first time she saw his face. His face was creepy even more than when she saw him with the mask. He was continuously staring at my best friend with his dangerous eyes. She turned her face and stood right there. The cops began searching the car and took her luggage out of the car. They searched every corner of the car, and just beside my friend's luggage, they found a small bag that was not her belongings. Later, they opened each of her luggages and checked it as well. She was watching all her belongings being thrown in the dust, but there was nothing she could have done right then. Also, this was their duty, and they were bound to do all this. She let them do what they were doing and remained standing there just beside them. They checked all her luggage, but found nothing suspicious there. But at last, it was the turn of the small bag which was not hers. So she was completely out of worries as she thought that the bag belonged to the cab driver. The cops opened the bag and found some white packets there. She started thinking what that could have been. Soon she was surprised to hear that the package which they got from the small bag was drugs. She had no idea that the cab driver was that kind of person, but she believed it, as his face was already too creepy to prove him a subject in this matter. The cops pulled their guns and pointed toward them. She was in fear, so she screamed that it was not her belongings, but the cab driver might be the one behind all this. But he completely rejected this fact and blamed my friend for everything. He also told the cops that the bag was not his belongings, but she had taken that bag along with his other entire luggage. He tried to act like an innocent who didn't even know the meaning of drugs. She kept on shouting that she was innocent, but the cops took both of them into their custody, as both of them were the suspects and both of them were blaming each other. So the cops took them for interrogation. My friend, who was going to a party celebration with her friend, ended up behind the bars. She was totally confused and horrified because she knew about the police torture. She kept on telling them that she was innocent, but none of them listened. They even took their phones and ID cards so that she couldn't contact anyone. She was in jail with that creepy driver who was the main mastermind behind all this. She was there for the next 3 hours, and meanwhile, she tried her best to convince the cops that she was innocent, but no one cared about her. Finally, The cops came to her to listen to her urge, and she explained everything. She told him everything in detail, and she also asked them to confirm her identity if they don't believe her. The cops looked decent, and he believed her and let her talk to her mother. She talked to her and explained everything. Her mother asked her not to cry and wait until she arrived with an advocate. She was there for the whole night, and due to stress, she couldn't get to sleep the whole night. The next morning, her parents came to her and proved her identity. They also hired an advocate for her, who spoke on their behalf, and finally, she was proven innocent. The cab driver was the real culprit, and he had many other fraud cases charged against him. The cops apologized to her for their mistake and let her go. She went with her parents happy, and the next day, she enjoyed the reunion party with her friends. She forgot everything soon, and then returned to her work. I am her colleague, and after returning from her hometown, she told me everything she experienced. Now she is married and left this country with her husband. It had been so long since she contacted me, and she even changed her contact number. I thought of sharing this story today because this was the same day when she told me this story.
I have spent the majority of my life living in Utah, with the exception of a few years spent in Wyoming. For the past couple of years, I have worked as an Uber Eats driver throughout the Utah area. The events I am about to describe took place only about 5 days ago. I had just finished up a long shift of delivering food and was catching up with my mother over the phone. During our conversation, I had the sudden idea to go find an old apartment complex where we had lived when I was much younger. Under normal circumstances, I always carry my new 9mm pistol with me for protection. However, on this particular day, I had left it at home. I decided to drive back to my house first to pick it up. I did not want to find myself in a bad situation without any form of defense. My mother had helped me by doing some research on the address. Back when I was a child, the complex was known as Midtown Villa. It was a quiet place back then and was never known for having any gang activity. Once I had the address, I entered it into Google Maps and began the drive over there. When I finally pulled into the complex, I noticed that the name had been changed to the Calaveras. The buildings and grounds actually looked much better and more updated than they did years ago. Because the area looked nice, I allowed myself to let my guard down. Looking back on that decision now, I regret it deeply. I began driving slowly through the apartment complex while still talking to my mother on the phone. We agreed to switch the call to a video chat so that I could show her all the new upgrades and changes. I pulled back through the entrance off the main road and started pointing out the specific building that used to be ours. Right next to it was an empty lot. I explained that the lot used to be a playground. This was where I made my first few mistakes. First, I was holding up a phone to show my mother the surroundings, which likely made it look like I was recording the people nearby. Second, I was pointing my finger at various buildings and areas. Third, I was in a dangerous area but had mistakenly lowered my guard. The reason these details matter is that I passed a man and a woman. I was pointing my hand in their direction. To me, it was a harmless trip down memory lane, but to them, it appeared that I was recording them or targeting them. I had unknowingly angered someone. Even though I now had my 9mm with me and a loaded magazine, I started making some odd choices because I am a very direct person. As I continued driving forward, I realized the man was chasing my car. He was yelling at me and calling me out. He was asking me if I wanted to tussle or fight him. He continued running toward my car and started taking photos of my vehicle and my license plate. Suddenly, I realized I needed to move. I sped up and made up my mind to get out of there immediately. The events that followed were influenced by the fact that I have extensive tactical training. However, in that moment, my adrenaline was pumping hard. Instead of using that energy to stay calm, I let it control my actions. With my mother still watching on video chat, I noticed a car pulling up quickly. I took off, but the car stayed right on my tail. I made a left turn, and they made a left turn. I made a right turn, and they followed with a right turn. I made the same turn again, and they were still there. I drove up to 9000 South and took a right after coming to a stop. I tried to tell myself I was paranoid, but I was wrong. They followed me all the way to 1300 West. I turned right again, and the same car followed me. I will not lie. I was incredibly nervous. Multiple scenarios were playing out in my head. I knew I was in a legitimate crisis. I knew that if it came down to a physical confrontation, I had my pistol ready. Many people would say I should have dialed 911 immediately. However, I am the type of person who rarely asks for help, and I felt I could handle getting out of this on my own. While I was weighing my options, I decided to turn right. I turned onto 7800 South. The following car did the same. Fortunately, a semi-truck managed to get between us, acting as a temporary barrier right behind my bumper. I felt a brief sense of relief. Eventually, the semi-truck turned left. Once the barrier was gone, I knew I had to make a definitive move. I decided to turn left toward the light that leads to 7200 South, where the I-15 on-ramp was located. I didn't fully consider what would happen if they continued to pursue me at high speeds. What happened next serves as a reminder to always ask for help when you need it. As I made the left turn, they followed and began speeding up in the lane to my right. Fearing they would pull up next to me and escalate the situation, I immediately used my signal and swerved. I moved in front of them. I then slowed down a little to control the space. They quickly moved into the left lane and sped up to get alongside me again. I accelerated to match them. Just as we both hit 90 miles per hour, I slammed on my brakes with everything I had. They also slammed on their brakes, but they suddenly veered and turned right. If I had been in that spot, they could have hit me, causing my car to roll. I could have been killed or ended up in the hospital. Instead, they sped off and I bolted for the interstate. I drove all the way to a grocery store near my house where I felt safe enough to stop. From there, I called the police department responsible for the area near the apartment complex. I explained the entire situation to the dispatcher. The dispatcher told me that I should have called 911 the moment it started. They explained that they could have directed me to a nearby police station. An officer eventually called me back to discuss the incident. He told me that the specific area around those apartments was very problematic and full of gang activity. He told me my judgment was accurate. I made sure to complete the official report right then because I wanted my version of events on the record first. I didn't want the police knocking on my door later based on the man's photos. After finishing the report, I finally went home. I didn't let my guard down until I was inside and knew I was safe. I told my fiancée about the encounter the next day. She was worried and told me never to deliver food in that area again without making sure I had protection. Looking back, there are 3 main lessons. First, never leave yourself without defense. Second, always ask for help or call the authorities when your life is at stake. Third, never be naive about your surroundings, no matter how nice they look. I hope this never happens to anyone else. Just remember, the people you really have to watch out for are not the ones with holsters. It is the ones who hide their weapons in their waistbands. Stay safe.
I can't forget that horrible moment that happened to me about 2 years ago. No matter how hard I try to forget, that incident left a deep mark on my mind. I never expected something like that to happen ever in my life, but just because of that incident, even now, I'm scared to go somewhere alone in an Uber cab. I don't know if other girls have experienced something like this or not, but even then, I thought that my story might teach someone at least something. I was only 19 at that time. Recently, I got a job in a bank and was working as a bank manager. My office was about 2 hours away from my home, but I had my car, so traveling was not hard for me. My father was a businessman and my mother was a doctor, so our way of living was perfect, and we had no worries about money and expenses. I used to go to my office daily at 9 a.m. and return at 6 p.m. My father was away from home often due to his business trips and other meetings and business stuff, and my mother worked in a nearby hospital, so she returned home before me. I also had a younger brother who was 14 only. One particular day, I was not feeling well, so I went to the office a little later than usual. It was already noon when I reached there. I arrived late but needed to complete my shift, so I worked till 8 p.m. And after completing my shift, I decided to return home. I had no fear as I had traveled all the times many times before, so I put my purse inside the car and hopped in. I put the key into the keyhole and turned it to start the engine, but it didn't. I tried again, but nothing happened. I tried many times, but nothing happened. It seemed like there was some problem with the engine, so I hopped out of the car and went inside the office again to get someone to help me. Fortunately, I found my colleague who was also my good friend. I asked him for my help and explained the whole situation. He came with me and tried to drive himself, but the car didn't start. He tried again and again, but nothing seemed to be working. Finally, he got out of the car and told me that I should get a mechanic. Our office was a little far from the town area, so it was not easy for me to go and take a mechanic with me to repair my car. I was stressed as it was already 9 p.m. and I had gotten 2 calls from my mother. I was being impatient, so after watching me so stressed out, he asked me to book a cab and return home today, and he would make my car repaired and then leave it at my home. I was not ready for this at first as I didn't want to disturb him, but I was already late and my health was also not in my favor. He booked an Uber for me and stayed there till the cab arrived. It took almost 10 minutes for the cab to reach there. He asked me to get in and return home. Meanwhile, he would take my car and get it repaired. He was a good and kind friend, so I trusted him and got into the car. He shared the OTP with the driver and asked him to take me to my home. I was already stressed, so I didn't notice the driver and kept looking out the window. After a few minutes of driving, I noticed that he was continuously turning his head to look at me and smiling while looking at my face. His creepy smile, oh my god, I couldn't forget that in my whole life. His eyes were filled with lust, and it seemed like he was going to eat me alive any moment. At first I ignored him and continued to look outside, but he was doing the same thing again and again, which irritated me after a few minutes. I shouted at him in a loud tone and told him to focus on the route, not me. He turned his face and didn't turn back for the next few minutes. I thought he got his lesson and didn't repeat this, but I was wrong. After a few minutes, I noticed that he was doing something with the driver's mirror. After a few seconds, I came to know that he was adjusting the mirror in such a way that he could easily see me. Now this all was getting frustrating with every passing minute. I decided to calm myself down and ignore him. I turned my face and decided not to look at him, but I couldn't do so. He was continuously staring at me and I was getting pissed off at his actions. I shouted again and told him, "Don't you mind your bullshit, just look ahead and drive." This time I was a little rougher than the last time, and he deserved that, but he was made up of thick skin. My words didn't do anything well. Till that time, I had only passed half the way and couldn't get to leave the car as it was already 10 p.m. the night. It was not safe for me, so I told myself that there was no point in telling him anything. It was better to bear with him for the next hour until I reached home. All of a sudden, he started opening his zip and pulled his penis out of his pants. I was completely stunned after seeing this. I couldn't believe my eyes that I was watching someone holding his 6-inch long penis in his hand right in front of me. I was feeling embarrassed, so I hid my face behind the seat and peeped at him. He started to masturbate while looking into the mirror. I wanted to tell him to stop this nonsense, but I don't know why I couldn't speak. It was like somehow my words got trapped in my throat and didn't come out. He was continuously driving while masturbating. The only good thing was that I was on the right route to my home. I decided not to look at him for the rest of the time. He continued with his masturbation again and again, and his sperm was spread all around his feet. I couldn't do anything, but I was in great fear. I didn't say anything to him. Fortunately, after a few minutes, I reached my home. He looked at me and shouted, "Ma'am, we have reached the destination. Please pay for the trip as I have another trip to attend." I opened my eyes and looked up. The driver was looking at me and I was in front of my home. That time, I knew that what I was seeing was all in my dream and I was in deep sleep the whole way. The driver was a kind old man, the same age as my father. I paid for his services and got out of the car. He thanked me and left from there. I went in and found that my mother was waiting for me in the hall. I looked all shocked and was smiling over my crazy dream, so she asked me what happened, but I couldn't tell her, and neither did anyone else until now.
This event took place about 3 or 4 years ago, and it is something that still crosses my mind quite often. During that time, I was back home from college for my summer break. My parents and sister had traveled out of town for a dance competition, which left me responsible for watching the house and looking after our dogs, while the rest of the family was away. It was a weekend night, likely a Friday or Saturday, and I had invited a few friends over. We spent the evening hanging out and drinking before we planned to head to a local bar. We were having such a good time catching up that we lost track of the clock, eventually deciding to leave for the bar around 11:15 p.m. One of my friends, who lived only a 5-minute walk away, suddenly realized he had left his entire wallet and eyed at his house. He decided to run ahead to grab it, while my other friend and I stayed behind for a moment to tidy up. We grabbed a final drink for the walk and started heading toward the other friend's house, where we intended to meet and call an Uber. To provide some context, my parents live in a quiet residential neighborhood just on the outskirts of the city. The area is mostly inhabited by families and elderly couples, so it is usually very peaceful. As my friend and I began our walk, we noticed a man walking a German Shepherd a short distance behind us. He was heading in the same direction we were. We both found it a bit odd that someone would be out walking a dog so close to midnight on a weekend, but we tried to ignore it and kept walking. We were 21 at the time, carrying our drinks and talking, trying to enjoy the night. However, as we got closer to our destination, my friend leaned in and whispered his concern that the man behind us was actually gaining ground and getting closer. I took a nervous look over my shoulder, but told him he was wrong, mostly because I didn't want us to panic. I looked back at my friend, but he glanced back again and shouted in fear, confirming that the man was indeed closing in. Right as he said that, I looked back and saw the man and his dog break into a full-on sprint toward us. Terrified, we dropped our cups and started running as fast as we could. When we reached my friend's house, we scrambled up the driveway to the side door, but to our horror, it was locked. We began banging on the door desperately, certain that the man and the dog were about to attack us. Instead of attacking, the man and his dog stopped at the end of the driveway and simply stared at us. My friend yelled out, demanding to know what he wanted and why he had chased us. Now that we had a better look, we could see he was an older man. In a scruffy, rough voice, he told us that we were trespassing. We both shouted back immediately, explaining that this was our friend's home, and we were just waiting for him to come outside. I was struggling to catch my breath, but managed to ask him if he was supposed to be the neighborhood watch. He simply confirmed that he was. My family has lived in that same house for my entire life, and I had never heard a single mention of a neighborhood watch, especially not one that patrolled the streets at midnight with a dog. After that brief exchange, the man and his dog turned around and walked away. There was a large brick wall bordering the driveway that blocked our view once they moved past it. Almost immediately after they vanished, my friend finally stepped out of the house with his wallet. He told us to be quiet because his parents were sleeping and asked what all the shouting was about. Our Uber pulled up at that exact moment. As I ran toward the car, at the end of the driveway, I looked down the street in the direction the man had gone, but I saw absolutely nothing. I asked the Uber driver if he had passed a man walking a German Shepherd on his way in. The driver told us that he hadn't seen anyone at all, even though he had just come from the exact direction the man had walked. I have never seen that man or his dog again, and the memory of that night still haunts me.
I should probably begin by making it absolutely clear that I am not one of those paranormal obsessed ghost-hunting loons who thinks every speck of dust in a photo is an orb. If I tell you that one of my favorite television programs is Penn and Teller's Bees, the show where they spend 40 minutes debunking nonsense conspiracy theories and fake psychics, then you probably have a very good idea of the kind of person I am. For the vast majority of my adult life, I moved through the world firmly believing that science and logic could account for every single occurrence in the universe. I believed the only restrictions on our understanding were the temporary limits of human knowledge. That was my worldview until something happened to me that I genuinely cannot explain through any conventional means. No matter how hard I have tried to rationalize it, I have never been able to come up with a legitimate, logical explanation for that night. The entire event freaked me out to such an extreme degree that it triggered a sort of hyperfixation in me that lasted for several months. I became so obsessed with finding an answer that even my most rational, skeptic friends started to worry that I was actually losing my mind. But I know for a fact that I haven't lost my mind. It really happened. Regardless of how many people try to tell me that it was just a trick of the light or my mind playing games due to exhaustion, I know exactly what I saw. It was an experience that effectively put the fear of God into me. To set the scene, we have to go back to the early spring of 2017. In the Northeast, that is the time of year when the sun still sets quite early and the air carries a lingering, sharp chill. It was approximately 9 p.m., and I was making the drive back to Narragansett from a friend's house in Newport. I decided to take a shortcut through Saunderstown to save some time. By that point in my life, I had done that specific drive at least 100 times. I felt so familiar with the roads that I joked I could navigate them with my eyes closed if I really had to. However, that sense of self-assured cockiness was likely my downfall. It had gotten me into trouble before, and it did so again that night. Somewhere halfway through the journey, I must have completely switched off mentally. I missed my turn and took a wrong one instead. Before I realized what was happening, I found myself pulling into a quiet, residential cul-de-sac to make a complete U-turn. I was so embarrassingly lost that I actually had to reach for my phone to pull up Google Maps. I checked my GPS position and mentally noted the series of turns I needed to make to get back toward the highway. I started to pull away from the curb and put my phone back in the center console when suddenly, there was a car directly in front of me. I slammed on my brakes with such force that the seatbelt locked against my chest. I let out a loud string of curse words, bracing myself for the inevitable sound of a blaring horn or a frustrated driver shouting at me. I immediately began mouthing apologies through the windshield, taking my hands off the steering wheel to gesture to the other driver. I silently signaled that I was sorry and that it was entirely my fault. As I was doing this, I noticed something incredibly unusual about the vehicle blocking my path. It was a legitimate museum-quality classic car. It wasn't just some 1970s muscle car like a Camaro. This was a Buick from the late 1930s or early 1940s. It was the exact kind of vehicle one would expect to see a high-ranking mobster like Al Capone stepping out of in Prohibition-era Chicago. The car was in pristine condition, appearing crisp and brand new. Whoever owned it must have poured an incredible amount of money and labor into the restoration, because every inch of it looked flawless under the streetlights. I suddenly realized that while I was busy admiring this vintage machine, I was still physically blocking the man's path. I put my car in reverse and gave the driver a friendly, nice car thumbs up, even pointing toward the polished hood of his Buick. The man did not react at all. Throughout the entire interaction, he simply sat there, staring and smiling at me through his windshield. As I began backing up to give him enough room to pass, I noticed that he looked remarkably like an old ventriloquist's dummy. There was something about the way his hair sat, or perhaps the waxy pale texture of his skin, that triggered that unsettling association in my brain. Then, just as I was about to give him enough space to drive around me, my car completely died. The engine cut out. The battery failed, and every light on my dashboard went dark. I began to jiggle the keys in the ignition with increasing panic, because I felt like a total idiot breaking down right in front of this man in his beautiful car. Nothing happened. The lights wouldn't flicker on, and the engine wouldn't even attempt to turn over. My first thought was sheer frustration, wondering why my battery would choose this exact moment to give up on me. My car was a bit of a junker back then. So while the timing was terrible, a mechanical failure wasn't entirely outside the realm of possibility. However, I was still obstructing the Buick driver, who I assumed was getting incredibly angry after sitting there for several minutes. I rolled my window down manually, leaned out into the cold air, and began yelling to the man. I told him that my car was dead and that he would have to try to maneuver around me. He didn't respond or acknowledge me in any way. Instead, I began to hear a very faint, creepy style of old music drifting from his car. I couldn't see his face anymore because his high-beam headlights were blinding me. He remained silent, and that strange song began to make the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Recalling this part of the story always causes a spike in my anxiety. As the situation evolved into a strange standoff, I sat in my driver's seat, wondering why the man wouldn't speak or move. I didn't want to honk my horn because the encounter had been polite up until that point. I just sat there in the silence, waiting and feeling a growing sense of dread. That was when the lights on my dashboard began to flicker weakly. I felt a surge of hope, thinking my battery might be regaining some life. I don't know much about automotive electronics, but I was willing to take any win I could get. I became excited at the prospect of finally ending this awkward encounter. I jiggled the keys again, but once more, the engine stayed dead. Then, my car radio suddenly burst into life at full volume. It started playing the exact same creepy song that was playing in the car. There were no lyrics to the track. It was just a haunting, repetitive tritone loop. The sound filled the cabin and moved through me with a profound sense of wrongness. I realized then that something truly bizarre was happening. The whole time, I was being blinded by the Buick's headlights. Then, without warning, the Buick's lights cut out. At that exact same second, my radio went silent. I was plunged into total darkness, and my eyes struggled to adjust after being stared down by those bright beams. While I was still half blinded, I reached for the ignition one last time. I felt a massive wave of relief when the engine finally roared back to life. But that relief lasted for only a fraction of a second. When my own headlights cut back on and illuminated the road ahead, the Buick was gone. The shock was so violent that I actually screamed out loud. I spun around in my seat, looking out the side and rear windows, expecting to see the taillights of the Buick as it drove away. There was absolutely nothing. The street was empty. It was as if the car had simply vanished into thin air. A massive, heavy car with an old engine should have made a considerable amount of sound, and I surely would have heard it driving past me even in my distracted state. Furthermore, only about 30 seconds had passed between his lights going out and my car starting up. For him to be completely out of sight, he would have had to accelerate like a modern race car. I felt a strange sensation, almost like I was high, even though I don't use drugs. I tried to convince myself that I had suffered a minor stroke or that perhaps my friend in Newport had slipped something into my drink as a prank. But I knew. I was as sober as a judge. I am always careful about that, especially with the Rhode Island State Troopers constantly looking for Dewey. Because I could find no logical way to explain the event, I fell into that hyperfixation I mentioned earlier. I went back to that specific cul-de-sac multiple times to look for tire marks or hidden driveways. I researched classic car owners in the area and spent hours reading medical journals about blackouts and time loss. I became convinced for a while that I had a condition called syncope, where the heart fails to pump enough oxygen to the brain. It seemed like a serious possibility, so I paid for a full medical checkup. The doctor listened to my heart, checked my blood pressure, and told me I was perfectly healthy. He suggested the episode might have been caused by stress, but I hadn't been feeling particularly stressed at the time. I even ventured into the darker corners of the internet, reading about UFO encounters and missing time, but I eventually realized I was going too far down a rabbit hole. However, I did have one interesting lead during my search for the classic car. I found a man in Middletown who had been trying to sell a 1937 Buick Special for several years. The car was currently a total wreck, but he hoped a collector would want to restore it. I pretended to be a buyer just so I could see it. His son sent me some photos of the rusted out vehicle. I cannot say for certain that it was the exact same model I saw in the cul-de-sac, but the resemblance was haunting. It is technically impossible for it to be the same car, given the one I saw was in mint condition while this one was a shell of rusted metal. Most people I tell this to suggest the car might have been involved in some past tragedy like a hit and run or a murder. The truth is, the seller didn't know the history. He said his father had purchased the Buick at a police auction and died before he could ever start the restoration. Whatever secrets the car held were buried with his father. I realize I have talked about this for quite a while now. I know that I sound like a fruitcake trying to explain these events. I will leave it to you to decide what happened that night. All I ask is that you don't tell me it was a ghost car. I have heard that for years and I am tired of it. Besides, if I truly believed in ghosts, it would terrify me to know I was that close to one and only barely escaped the encounter.